Good morning and welcome to this week's programme, an edition in which we hear the life story of the late Bishop of Derry, Dr. Edward Daly. His experience on Bloody Sunday, the priest waving the white handkerchief, a photograph which went round the world. His happy childhood, his less happier boarding school days, his becoming a priest, not he remembers, thought through at the time, his years as a student in Rome, and much more, and his role in Derry as bishop. First this morning, this historic recording.
As I was about halfway across the Court of the Flats, I heard the first shot.
The voice of Bishop Edward Daly, who died in August.
And a little boy who was running, about 16, beside me, and slightly behind me actually, about 5 feet from me. He screamed and kind of groaned and fell to the ground.
This is the original recording, unedited, of Father Edward Daly talking to Kevin Healy for RTE News, Bloody Sunday, January 1972.
I thought he'd been hit by a rubber bullet first of all, and I looked back, and then I heard more shooting, and I just lay flat on the ground. And I looked back over my shoulder, and I saw a woman being run over by a sergeant who was driven straight at her, and I saw blood spurting from this boy's chest out through his shirt. So I crawled back over, and there's a young Knights of Malta lad and myself, and I administered the last rites to this boy, who I think almost died instantly. Just by laying.
You're satisfied, Father, if I can interrupt you, you're satisfied this boy wasn't firing a gun, right?
No, absolutely no. He was running just beside me. He was doing the same things I was doing, trying to get us out of the place as fast as he could.
At the time, Father Daly was a 39-year-old curate.
There was no guns fired at the army before, and anything that the army say about that is absolutely untruthful. This is an occasion that I saw completely from the start with my own eyes. I'm prepared to swear this. I hope I have an opportunity to do it in front of some international tribunal. There's certainly, I've no doubt whatsoever, and I state this absolutely categorically, that there was no shots fired at the army prior to them opening fire. And the army kept firing for a period. I just don't know how long it was. I was lying there out in the courtyard beside this little boy in the Knights of Malta myself. And I know he was weeping, and I think I was weeping too, whether it was with fear or just the whole horror of the thing. I saw another boy over about 20 yards from me beside the guards of the flats being hit, and he tumbled over and he screamed, and one of his legs went up grotesquely in the air and whirled around. It's a sight I'll never forget. To be quite honest, I was too frightened to go over to him. I just stayed with the little boy I was with. And after a while then, 2 other civilians crawled out with white handkerchiefs, and they took up a position beside us out in the middle of the flats courtyard. And we decided that we'd try to get the little boy, although we thought he was dead, but we decided to try and get to some first aid post or other, and I got up in front of them, and we kind of crouched and waved a handkerchief. It was covered in the wee lad's blood, and went across in front of them and along Chamberlain Street. He was carried by these other men and through the army lines, and eventually we got to Waterloo Street. And there we managed to get an ambulance taken to hospital. He was dead.
Father Edward Daly in 1972. A quarter of a century later, Bishop Edward Daly was invited by the Savile Inquiry to tell them what he had seen on Bloody Sunday.
I got, in autumn of 1998, I had a letter from the Savile solicitors, Everards. They enclosed in the letter 3 contemporaneous statements I'd made in February 1972, and invited me to submit a statement for their tribunal on the events that I'd witnessed on 30th of January 1972. And I started to prepare that statement, and really the book developed from back to front. I started at the end and worked my way back, rather than, I suppose, as most people do, start at the beginning and work their way forward.
And when this book was published, this memoir, Mr. Are You a Priest?, Bishop Daly spoke to Pat Kenny.
It's not a political analysis. It's certainly not a theological treatise. It's simply, as I call it, a ragbag of jottings, of recollections, of memories that I've had. Indeed, I had a panic about in the 3 months ago, as publication approached. A lot of it was written from memory. And even in recent times, I started scrupling about it and wondering, was it a figment of my imagination, or did that really happen? Fortunately, with all of the situations in the book, all of them that I could, I checked it with people who were there, and I think they are fairly accurate, I think.
And in that same interview, he spoke about his boyhood and his education.
Well, I was born in Ballyshannon, County Donegal. I grew up in Ballyke. My parents lived there, right on the border, about 100 yards from the border. That's where I grew up. I had a blissfully happy childhood. I had wonderful teachers at school. It was a lovely environment, to grow up in as a child. I grew up during the Second World War, and I had the excitement of a lot of big air bases quite nearby and all the traffic going overhead. I worked in my father's shop as a child. I just helped in it. I suppose I didn't work, but I was always there. It left me, I think, easy in the company of people subsequently. And most people who write seem to have sad childhoods, but I had a blissfully happy childhood. I suppose maybe it's less interesting than other childhoods, but my childhood was very, very happy to grow up in.
And you developed a love of theatre in your childhood.
Yes, I did. The touring rep companies came around at that time, and Anya McMaster, Carrickfords, came to Beleek to McCabe's Hall, performed there. There was also an amateur dramatic group there, and it was the producer was a customs man in the Irish Customs called McCann. Subsequently, Tomas McCanna, director of the Abbey Theatre. So it was a particularly good drama group. And also, I've been an addict of films ever since childhood. Every Sunday afternoon, I cycled into Ballyshannon with some others and went to the pictures there. And I've loved film ever since then. I love theatre.
What about your education?
I came to St. Colum's in Derry. I won a small scholarship. There was no second level education in Fermanagh at that time. And I won a small scholarship to St. Colum's College in Derry, and I came there as a boarder in 1946 and spent 5 years there. It was my first time in Derry, the first day I came to St. Colum's. It wasn't I call it in the book, not the happiest years of my life. It wasn't a particularly enjoyable period. I didn't like boarding school particularly. I enjoyed the education.
You found it a cruel enough environment?
It was a tough, hard, harsh, unloving environment, yes. That was my experience of boarding school. Other people, even contemporaries might may have had different experiences, but that was my experience.
Yeah. It struck you as strangely unchristian.
Yes, there was a lack of love in it, which I think should be at the centre of Christianity. There was a lack of caring in it, and it was a very lonely time for me. I think my liberty was curtailed. I had the run of the whole place as a child. I was able to cycle around and go anywhere I wanted, and suddenly I was enclosed within all these walls, and I didn't particularly like that. But I got a good education there, and perhaps I've been too harsh in the book, but that's the way I saw it at the time, and there were a lot of good people there, very good teachers and some very caring teachers, but there were some who weren't so caring. But that was the culture of the time.
And elsewhere in the archives, Bishop Edward Daly spoke to Richard Pine about the importance of music in his life.
Right from the very beginnings of my life, one of the things I remember would have been Irish traditional music and growing up at home and right on the Fermanagh-Donegal border.
Yes.
From an interview in April 1992.
There was a band there. There's a very famous individual from there, Patrick Tunney, who is a well-known singer of Irish traditional songs, and he grew up there. His brother had a céilí band there. There were a lot of very good traditional musicians there. One of the great heroes of my childhood was Sean Maguire, the traditional fiddler, whose work I've always admired and still like very much.
Is traditional music being your first love, would it still be your greatest, or have you along the way acquired other musical
I don't
tastes?
like to have a hierarchy of values in music. I like good music, period, whatever type it is. I'm afraid I wouldn't include hard rock and that sort of thing in it.
All right.
But virtually all kinds of music, well performed, well played, I like enormously.
He told Pat Kenny that he had drifted into the priesthood. It was not his first notion of a career.
It was something I drifted into. Something I've never regretted either. I drifted into it, and I was interested in going to Queen's to do analytical chemistry, and I was also interested in teaching, and I ultimately opted for priesthood, and I could not say why. I just don't know. There were a lot of priests in childhood that I greatly regarded. I've always liked being with people. I suppose ministering to people. That has always appealed to me. The idea of serving one's neighbour has always been a very strong ethic in my life.
But did you miss analytical chemistry? I mean, did you keep an interest in it?
No. I think once I got to Rome, I went into a new world, a new culture. I was simply swept off my feet in Italy. I fell in love with the place and with the whole way of life there and the whole culture. And really, going to Rome after St. Colum's was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and a sudden liberation.
And that was
one
a serendipity as well, because you weren't scheduled to go to Rome.
No, I was to go to Maynooth, and the last minute things were changed, and I was sent to Rome, and I was horrified initially. Going out there, going abroad at that time was a big deal. When people in America at that time, the opposite, they weren't going back, and going to Rome seemed a very long way away, and we went away for 2 years at a time.
Yeah, I would have thought that Rome, it's the most unlikely place to be the ecclesiastical centre of the Catholic Church, because I would think it would test anyone's vocation.
Yes, Rome will test anybody's vocation, I think. But it's a wonderful city. There are a lot of Romes. There's ancient Rome, Imperial Rome, there's Renaissance Rome, and then there's modern Rome, which is as modern a city as one can get. And it's a wonderful place. There's great vitality about it.
And do you go back there?
Yes, I go back fairly often. I was there last month with the pilgrimage from here, and I go back. The Irish College is very much, I feel very much at home. And the thing about Rome is you go back to Rome 50 years later and things haven't changed. The same shops are there, the same names in the shops. Nothing has changed. And you get surprised at that, but then you look down the street and there's something that's been there since 1100.
And Richard Pine, in his music department interview, also talked to Bishop Daly about how he had responded to Rome as a young student for the priesthood.
For any person who lives on an island to go abroad, I think it's a tremendously liberating influence. And for me, it opened up a whole new range of experiences. I remember the very first Sunday I was in Rome, I heard the Sistine Choir for the first time. And the impact of that was quite extraordinary. And I think one must remember at that time that records, I'd never heard a record of the Sistine Choir. I don't think I'd ever heard a broadcast of the Sistine Choir.
Yes.
But the first time to meet music being sung to that standard was quite a remarkable experience. And then there was the secular music, if you
Yes.
like, of Italy, the opera, the Neapolitan songs particularly, which I've always loved enormously and still love. I remember one occasion going to the Baths of Caracalla to see Aida. We weren't supposed to go; it was forbidden, verboten.
Of course, yes.
And but a lot of us found ways and means of doing that, and that was an experience that I'll always remember. I think to see opera in Caracalla is really...
It's quite a spectacle, isn't it?
And I don't think there's any opera like Aida for spectacle.
Quite.
And especially the Caracalla production of it.
After his ordination, Castle Derg had been his first posting to a parish.
Wonderful, wonderful. I enjoyed Castle Derry. I had a wonderful old parish priest there. He was, when he saw me coming, he checked out. He said, "Look, you take over." And it was heady stuff for a 23-year-old at that time.
So he just took a back seat?
He took a back seat. He said, you look after things. I got myself in a lot of trouble, of course, at times, but through naivety, perhaps. But it was a wonderful start. I lived in digs for 5 years in 3 different digs. And that, too, was a very powerful experience in my life. And it was the first time that I came in contact with the unionist culture as well, because in Balik it was, whilst we had neighbours who were Protestant, Methodist actually, and they were very good friends of mine. I was in their house all the time during childhood, and indeed still are. It was the first time I really came across a large community that wasn't Catholic. And that was a very powerful influence also in my life.
But you observed also that the Catholic population were quite passive in the face of what in later years would be seen as provocation by other Catholic communities.
Yes, I think the marching season was always a difficult period in Castlereagh, but the Catholic community really kept their heads down. Most the Catholic community in the north did keep their heads down at that time.
But were they affronted by this? I mean, was it as arrogantly triumphalist as some of the marches that we would see today, or was it something much more like pageant and procession?
It wasn't pageant and procession, but it wasn't like it is today either. It wasn't as aggressive or as in your face as it is today. For example, at that time I describe in the book where I came back to my digs one day for lunch, and there was a parade going on, and there was the black men, the black preceptory, and they were marching, and the house that I was in was Catholic, and it was filled with black men having their lunch. And the room I was in a workplace that left a lot of the regalia, their collarettes and so forth, and the bowler hats and so forth. I came in, I couldn't resist the temptation of putting on the collarette, putting on the bowler hat, and I finished up doing a Harry Worth. Do you know what Harry Worth is? Against the window. And but it's been thinkable now, perhaps, that could happen.
And they didn't have a problem laying their bits and pieces down on a Catholic priest's bed.
But they didn't. Well, I don't think they knew he was there. But it's one of my happier memories. But it was. The Catholic community were passive, but I think in the north as a whole they were at that time.
But
and
how did it prepare you for Derry then? Because Derry would have been a completely different situation.
It was completely different, but it introduced me to priesthood, I think, first of all. It introduced me to the idea of being with people in the difficult moments of their lives and sharing the happy moments of their lives. It confronted me with grief and death, also with enormous happiness. I was able to indulge in my interest in theatre and drama for the first time, and do that sort of thing. But the people there were wonderful people, and I still have an enormous love for them and for that place, both sides of the community there.
Elsewhere in the archives, in a conversation with Rodney Rice, Bishop Daly insisted that his basic analysis of the northern problem was that it was a colonial issue.
When the settlement was made, there was a very significant religious dimension to that settlement. And unfortunately that has persisted until the present day.
This was first broadcast in January 1983.
And when the state, if you could call it state of Northern Ireland, was set up in 1921, it was done on a sectarian head count. So that sectarianism is enshrined in the very structure of Northern Ireland as it exists today. And the boundary was decided on the basis of a religious head count. It was called Ulster, a 6-county Ulster, despite the fact that the historical Ulster was 9 counties. And unfortunately everything here is shot through with religious prejudice, religious domination, and there is a very significant religious dimension to the problem. Certainly I could not deny that. It's there for all to see, and anybody who would deny it, I think, is not being quite honest about it, or else is not familiar with the problem.
What sort of examples would you use of the areas that are where this religious dimension is shot through the various institutions?
Well, I think in the very border, I think it is the most significant religious dimension, where it was constructed, devised, drawn on the basis of a religious head count, a Protestant Parliament for Protestant people. That has been the whole reason of the existence of Northern Ireland, to preserve Protestant domination here. And to my mind, that if you have that very fundamental structure based on that, it's bound to inhibit everything else within that particular institution, and unfortunately that has been the case.
Back to the publication of his memoir and its title, Mr. Are You a Priest? He told Pat Kenny how the title of the book came about.
It happened, I think, on the first or second day I was in the Bogside as a priest. I came down into Nelson Street, I think it was, and there were a group of kids playing small nippers, and there was a wee fella sitting in a cardboard box. I still can see him as clear as today. He looked up at me and closed one eye and said, "Hi, mister, are you a priest, hey?" You know? But the publishers decided that the 2 highs should be left out because that would be too Derry. Yeah. So Mr. Are You a Priest was the title that we stayed with.
And on the occasion of the publication of his book, he looked back over 30 years to the beginnings of the civil rights movement.
There was a great build-up of discontent, and there were people felt that they were unjustly treated, but they didn't know how they could channel this anger and sense of injustice. And I think 68 was the big year. The whole culture during the 60s changed. At the beginning of the 60s, people were very accepting of things. People were in their place and accepted that place in society. Things started to change in the 60s. I think the music culture had a lot to do with it. The Beatles were there, the protests were there. There was a Vietnam War and the questions being asked about
and Paris in 68, the students
yes, and
rioting.
Martin Luther King, and all of these things started happening one after the other.
And not alone that, they were in people's living rooms for the first time, yes, visually.
They had television, and they were able to see that the situation they were living in was not par for the course in Western society. And I think they were anxious to find some way of channeling that anger and protest. And also, there is also another thing to it, an element in it. When you're in a situation where you're being badly treated, feeling that you're being discriminated against and hard done by, and nobody seems to care a damn or worry about you, discrimination to perpetuate the political control of a minority in the city. And gradually more and more people became aware of that. And the civil rights movement presented the channel in which people expressed their anger and their concern and their appeal to the wider world to listen to our cry and do something about this.
And the Education Act, which allowed access to education.
That also, I think, was a very, very powerful factor. 1947 Education Act, which allowed universal education, that everyone got educated to the fullness of their ability, whatever their material background or class background should be. That was a very powerful factor. It was initially the 1944 Act in Britain introduced into the North here in 1947. And I think education is the most powerful single influence in liberation. And in the middle of the 60s, the young people who'd been taken advantage of this Education Act began to emerge from the universities for the first time. Young people from the bog side, and they were able to articulate the feelings of people in a way that the people could understand and in a way that the media could understand.
In his interview with Rodney Rice, Dr. Daly defended denominational schools.
Well, I would encourage certainly Catholic parents to send their children to Catholic schools. I believe very much in the value of them. I believe very much that the school should be an extension of the home. I believe that religious truths, prayers, devotions, etc. should be presented to children as they were presented to me at an early age. I believe very, very much in that. I also recognise absolutely the right of the parent to think otherwise. And quite a number of parents in this diocese do think otherwise and do send their children to state schools. I respect the right to do that, absolutely. I visited those schools. But the fact is that most parents want to send their children to Catholic schools.
So you put no impediment in their way?
Oh no, absolutely not. Not in any way. No, I respect their right, absolutely. I think if you do, I think you undermine your position. I mean, I think the position of the Catholic school is the right of parental choice. I think if you start interfering with that right, I think you undermine your own position. I think we must respect the differing viewpoints that are here, and I think it's a matter of a person from one community respecting the person from the other end of the community. He or she does not have to change his own political, religious outlooks or endeavour to change the religious, political outlooks of the other.
And speaking to Pat Kenny, Bishop Daly said that at the time of the civil rights movement, he had not anticipated that the troubles would become so violent or that they would last as long as they had.
People in Derry had said that guns, that's something that will happen in Belfast, but not here. Derry has no tradition of that. No, I'd never anticipated that it would have gone as badly as it did go, and that the kind of events that we experienced in Derry here, the suffering that people experienced, I didn't think that would ever happen.
And I mean, we all know about your involvement on Bloody Sunday, of which we'll speak in a moment. But I mean, you had all sorts of other activities. I mean, you had to defuse a bomb at one point.
Yes, with Ivan Cooper here, we were. It was one night after John Hume was arrested, and Ivan Cooper's arrested, and rumours went around that they'd been interned, and it was just over here, just down below here, and they came back. They were released from the barracks at about 8:30, and there was a big crowd gathered, and they were carried back shoulder high. They gave speeches there, and after it was all over and people started drifting away, Ivan and I were chatting together, and a fella came over to us and he said, "We've a problem." I didn't know the fellow. I don't know whether Ivan knew him or not. And he said that they'd planted a bomb in Garton Square, which is just up there, in a corner of a children's playground, in a tea chest, and that they tried to draw the army in, but the army hadn't risen to the bait and come in, and they were frightened that the army had spotted the bomb and that they staked out the place, and they were afraid to go back and retrieve it. So they asked us, could we go and retrieve it? So he told us what to do, and it was a pretty basic, at that time they weren't very sophisticated, it was a pretty basic device. So we had a chat with one another for a while, and we decided we'd go first of all to the police to check if the place was staked out, because we didn't want to be shot if we went in to deal with it. So we asked the police. The police were very busy. They kind of listened to us and told us to. I don't think they believed us. They thought we were nutcases, and they told us to go on ahead. And we were nutcases, perhaps. And we went up. Behind a row of houses. We found the bomb where it was. There was a wire leading from. We followed the wire up, and we found it was to a car battery. It was covered by sacking, and we disconnected, as the guy had told us, to one of the leads that had been connected. Then we went back and we pulled the fuse out of the device, and nothing happened.
You're still here to tell me the story.
Yeah. Well, we then. I even got the bright idea that this about 12 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, that'd be a good idea to leave the car battery outside John Hume's house, which we did. I don't know if John or Pat ever came across it.
The events of Bloody Sunday have defined many lives since that terrible day. Your recollection of it, I mean, I can only imagine what would happen if it happened in my own place. It didn't simply kill and injure people. It did something to the city itself. It almost inflicted a wound from which the city hasn't really recovered.
I describe the events of that day as constituting a defining moment in my life. Certainly, I think it also was a defining moment in the lives of many people in this city. It was a dreadful event. It was the only time in my life that I ever saw one person bringing a gun to his shoulder and aiming it and firing it at another person and seeing the other person actually be struck. This was Michael Bridge, who was injured. I think that happened while I was kneeling beside a young boy who was dying. So I think events like that, they never leave you. Those events still haunt me today, and I still remember the events of that day as clearly as if they happened yesterday. I suppose anybody who's been through a traumatic experience in their lives has that same kind of reaction, and I think it's something that lives with you.
And Bishop Edward Daly died in August last. This morning's programme was based on original programmes by Kevin Healy, Richard Pine, Pat Kenny, Rodney Rice and myself. More voices from the archives at the same time on Sunday morning next. Thank you for listening this morning, and good morning.